Hello everyone! Once again, a pleasant day to all. And today we will continue our discussion about the philosophical perspectives of self. And in the part 1 episode, we already talked about the contributions of various philosophers in understanding the self, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Saint Augustine, Descartes, and John Locke. Today, we will proceed to the propositions of David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Sigmund Freud, Gilbert Ryle, Paul Churchland, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So let's have the proposition of David Hume. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher and economist. He was a fierce opponent of Descartes' rationalism. Hume is one of the figureheads of empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that the origin of all knowledge is sense experience. He said, all knowledge is derived from human senses. There is no self. Hume suggests that if people carefully examine their sense experience through the process of introspection, they will discover that there is no self. According to Hume, what people experience is just a bundle or collection of different perceptions, impressions, sensations, ideas, thoughts, and images. The idea of personal identity is a result of imagination. And then we have also Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is a central figure in modern philosophy. Among other ideas that Kant proposed was that the human mind creates the structure of human experience. We construct the self. According to Kant, it is the self that makes experiencing an intelligible world possible, because it is the self that is actively organizing and synthesizing all of our thoughts and perceptions. In other words, the self constructs its own reality, creating a world that is familiar and predictable. Through our rationality, the self transcends sense experience. Kant proposed that there are two components of self. First one is the inner self, and the second one is the outer self. The inner self refers to the self which you are aware of alterations in your own state. This includes your rational intellect and psychological state, such as moods, feelings, and physical world. It gathers information from the external world through the senses, which the inner self interprets and coherently expresses. And this is the outer self. So Kant said, reason is the final authority of morality. So morality is achieved only when there is absence of war because of the result of enlightenment. Then we have also Sigmund Freud. Freud was a philosopher, physiologist, and psychologist. He was one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. And his most important contribution, particularly in psychology, is psychoanalysis, a practice devised to treat mental illness. According to Freud, the self is multi-layered. According to him, the self consists of 3 layers: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. The conscious self is governed by reality principle and is organized in ways that are rational, practical, and appropriate. And the unconscious contains the basic instinctual drives that would be considered socially taboo and is governed by pleasure principle. And much of the self is determined by unconscious. The preconscious is located between the conscious and the unconscious part of the self that is threatening and is easily brought to mind. Freud said that wish fulfillment is the road to the unconscious. And he proposed the existence of unconscious as follows. First, a repository for traumatic repressed memories, and second, the source of anxiety-provoking drives that is socially or ethically unacceptable to the individual. Freud uses the analogy of the icebergs to describe the 3 levels of the mind. Further, he presented the structure of the psyche or the mind into 3 types: the id, the ego, and superego. In psychology, psyche is the totality of the human mind, both conscious and unconscious. Then we also have Gilbert RYLE. RYLE was a philosopher and professor who produced a critique on Descartes' idea that the mind is distinct from the body. The self is the way people behave, according to Gilbert RYLE. And he asserted that sensations, thoughts, and feelings do not belong to a mental world separate from the physical world. The self is best understood as a pattern of behavior, the tendency or disposition for a person to behave in a way or a certain way in a certain circumstances. Ryle's concept of the human self thus provided the philosophical principle, I act, therefore I am. In short, the self is the same as bodily behavior. For example, you think of yourself as a kind person because of your acts of kindness. Your actions will define your own concept of self. And another philosopher is Paul CHURCHLAND. Paul CHURCHLAND was a philosopher and a professor. His philosophy stands on the materialistic view or the belief that nothing but matter exists. If something can be seen, felt, heard, touched, or tasted, then it exists. There is nothing beyond the sensory experience, according to CHURCHLAND. CHURCHLAND proposed the idea of eliminative materialism, or the claim that people's common sense understanding of the mind is false. And he said that the self is the brain. The self is inseparable from the brain and the physiology of the body. All we have is the brain, and so if the brain is gone, there is no self. For Churchland, the physical brain and not the imaginary mind gives us our sense of self. The mind does not exist or does not really exist. It is the brain and not the imaginary mind that gives us our sense of self. So he said the self is the brain. And lastly, philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He was a philosopher and author, and he emphasized the body as the primary site of knowing the world. The self is embodied subjectivity. All knowledge of ourselves and our world is based on subjective experience. So the self can never be truly objectified or known in a completely objective sort of way. Merleau-Ponty argued that the body is part of the mind and the mind is part of the body. That although there could be a standalone mental faculty that perceives what the senses experience, it needs the body to receive these experiences, act on it and its perceptions, and communicate with the external world. The mind and body are inseparable. One's body is his opening towards his existence to the world. The living body, his thoughts, emotions, and experiences are all one. According to him, the body acts what the mind perceives as a unified one. Truly, the philosophical musings have produced some of the most important original ideas over the centuries, especially in various areas of learning and, of course, in understanding the self. So thank you so much and continue learning.